Assalamu alaikum everyone. My name is Saima Rashid and I'm a research assistant at Center for Islam and Global Affairs. On behalf of Center for Islam and Global Affairs at Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University, I welcome you all to our Ramadan webinar series. Today is our 20th lecture and we're very pleased to have with us Dr. Hafsa Kanjwal. Dr. Hafsa Kanjwal is an assistant professor of South Asian history at Lafayette College in the United States, and she's joining us from United States itself. Dr. Hafsa, you have 50 minutes, and while you'll be talking, because we'll be live on Facebook as well, so you can drop your questions on our Facebook page as well as in the Q&A section here. So, Dr. Hafsa, you can unmute your microphone and start your lecture.
Assalamu alaikum everyone. Thank you so much for having me to CIGA, and also I hope everyone is having a blessed Ramadan so far. So I wanted to start my talk off with a little bit of a clarification. Although I will be discussing Hindu nationalism and Hindutva and its impact in both India and occupied Kashmir, I want to make it clear that in no way did things only start to get bad in India with the rise of Modi, the BJP, or the ascent of Hindutva. Unfortunately, in public discourse, the media, and sometimes even scholarship, there's this demarcation between India as it was or somehow is at its core, which is seen as some form of an ideal democratic secular government memorialized by its first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, and India as it is today under Modi, as if that is a complete tangent from what India has always been. I think nothing can be further from the truth. In many ways, I would argue that what we are seeing today unfolding in both India and occupied Kashmir is an acceleration of processes and ideologies that have existed since the late colonial period, and actually seamlessly existed in what has been seen as a secular and democratic post-colonial India. Now, these developments may be more blatant or extreme today, but it's important to recognize that when it comes to certain underlying logics about Islam and Muslims, India, in all of its ideological forms, has always engaged in violent majoritarianism. In fact, recent historical scholarship has showcased exactly how fragile India's democratic and secular credentials were right from its inception in 1947, in the very period Indian liberals gazed upon with nostalgia. We see this in the way that the Indian state sought to ensure that the Muslim children of abducted Hindu and Sikh women in Pakistan would not be returned to India with their mothers because they were tainted with the Muslim blood of their fathers. We can also see this in the discriminatory practices in housing and rehabilitation that pushed out Muslims from cities like Delhi in order to accommodate Hindu and Sikh refugees from Pakistan after the partition. More recently, we see this in the Sucha Committee report, which was submitted to the Indian Prime Minister in 2006 and revealed the systematic discrimination of the Indian Muslim community in the political, economic, and social life of India. All that to say, this is a much larger story of bigotry, othering, and disenfranchisement. Indian Muslims as a community have had their loyalties to the Indian state questioned and have had to perform a certain amount of good Muslimness in order to survive. This is also a community that has borne its brunt of violence, from the destruction of the Babri Masjid in 1992 to the anti-Muslim pogrom in the state of Gujarat in 2002, as well as a whole host of other similar pogroms and massacres. These incidents have not just occurred against the Muslim community, but other religious minorities as well. One of the most horrific moments in post-colonial India's history was the 1984 massacre against the Sikhs, a massacre that was abetted by leaders of the allegedly secular Indian National Congress at the time. This is also why many Sikh groups have extended their solidarity to Muslims, including Kashmiri Muslims. Nonetheless, there is something different about the particular threat of Hindu nationalism or Hindutva in terms of what it seeks to do. If secular, i.e. liberal majoritarian India sought to manage Muslim religious identity and put Muslims in their place, Hindutva seeks nothing short of their annihilation. This is why this is an extremely difficult time for both Indian Muslims and Kashmiri Muslims, both of whom are currently under genocide watch. So today, I want to speak specifically about what Hindutva is, what this project calls for, and how it is playing out with India's Muslims and other minorities, as well as in occupied Kashmir. And I speak about these contexts separately. While there are some interconnections, it's important not to subsume what is happening to Kashmiri Muslims into the same narrative of what is happening with India's minorities, given that the former do not see themselves as a minority within India, but rather as an occupied people. Okay, so what is Hindutva? On a fundamental level, Hindutva is an ideological project that seeks to create the territories that it envisions under its fold, what its followers call the Akhund Bharat, as an upper caste Hindu state or Rashtra. It believes in the racial and cultural superiority and purity of Hindus, claims to be representative of all Hindus, and also plays upon a narrative of victimhood. One of the impacts of British colonial rule was the emergence of multiple reform and revivalist religious movements amongst the diverse and competitive religious landscape in South Asia. Of these, within Hinduism, groups like the Arya Samaj argued for an ancient spiritual glory of Indian civilization, sought to purify Hinduism and bring those who had converted out of Hinduism back within its fold. The term Hindutva itself came from V.D. Savarkar, a Brahmin who would later become the president of the Hindu Mahasabha, a political party that broke off from the Indian National Congress in the 1930s for not representing Hindu interests more aggressively. In his 1923 book, Hindutva, Who is a Hindu?, Savarkar argues that Aryans had settled in India and were the ancestors of Hindus. He argued that Hindutva stemmed from three factors: 1, geographical unity; 2, racial purity; and 3, a common culture based on the language of Hindi. Hindutva essentially superimposed one religion, culture, and language onto a sacred territory. In his vision of Hindutva, religious minorities, including Muslims and Christians, had to assimilate to the majority religion. The Hindu Mahasabha in particular viewed Muslims who were mobilizing for their political rights in the late colonial period as a threat. The Akhund Bharat, if you look at the map, is seen as the holy land for Hindus, encompassing other nations of South, East, and Central Asia. It actually overflows from the current parameters of the Indian nation state and includes places like Nepal, Pakistan, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and even Afghanistan. In some cases, it has even included Thailand and Cambodia. Just as a side note, in December 2015, in an interview with Al Jazeera, the BJP National Secretary Ram Madhav said that and I quote him, "The RSS still believes that one day India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh which have for historical reasons separated only 60 years ago, will again through popular goodwill come together and Akhund Bharat will be created." End quote. Savarkar's ideas were later expounded upon by another figure named M.S. Golwalkar, who was the supreme leader of the RSS. The RSS, or the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, was founded in 1925 and is a paramilitary voluntary organization, the largest group in the Hindu nationalist movement. The foot soldiers of Hindutva, the RSS has over 57,000 branches throughout India, where it grooms its cadres with a mix of martial and ideological training. It has an armed militia of over 600,000 volunteers. It runs schools, charities, health clinics, women's groups, media organization, and has infiltrated into every aspect of civil and social life in India. In 1940, in his book, We or Our Nationhood Defined, Golwalkar writes, and I quote, "Ever since that evil day when Muslims first landed in Hindustan, right up to the present moment, the Hindu nation has been gallantly fighting to take on these despoilers. In Hindustan, land of the Hindus, live and should live the Hindu nation. All others are traitors and enemies to the national cause, or to take a charitable view, idiots. The foreign races in Hindustan may stay in the country wholly subordinated to the Hindu nation, claiming nothing, deserving no privileges, far less any preferential treatment, not even citizens' rights." End quote. You don't have to look much further than this quote to imagine what the Hindutva project entails. When you look at the reference to the foreign races, it means Muslims. These early leaders of Hindutva had internalized the rhetoric of the colonial state and Orientalists that not only saw India as being essentially Hindu, but also depicted the Muslims as being invaders to India, and aggressively spreading their religion and way of life by the sword upon a passive and weak Hindu population. Golkar continues. To keep up the purity of its race and culture, Germany shocked the world by her purging the country of the Semitic races, the Jews. Raised pride as its highest has been manifested here, a good lesson for us in Hindustan to learn and profit by. End quote. The direct comparisons to Nazism and European fascism are not accidental. Indeed, Hindutva ideologues were inspired by the Nazis and Italian fascists of the 1930s and the 1940s. This rhetoric calls for the same kind of purity to create a supremacist state in which religious and cultural minorities must be violently assimilated or annihilated to bring back the idea of the pure nation. Muslims are to Hindutva what the Jewish community was to the Nazis. Aside from its anti-Muslimness, Hindutva is also based on the Brahmanical understandings of the caste system which it sees as natural. As a number of Dalit activists and scholars have noted, casteism is at the root of Hindutva. More importantly, though, these scholars and activists have taken on Hinduism itself, and not just Hindutva, as an oppressive system because of its adherence to the caste system. This is actually an important and, as you can imagine, contested discussion that is increasingly becoming sort of discussed in scholarly and other circles. Hindu nationalists played a role in furthering religious divides during the 1947 partition of the Indian subcontinent. A member of the RSS also killed Gandhi immediately after partition, accusing him of being too tolerant to India's Muslims. As a result, the RSS was banned. But its ideology survived in political parties like the Jan Sangh, a predecessor of today's BJP. In 1980, the BJP, or the Bharatiya Janata Party, was formed to represent Hindu nationalist interests in the electoral realm in the wake of the decline of the Indian National Congress. It was able to form state governments and became the dominant partner in multiple All India coalition governments, eventually winning national elections in 1998. The RSS had also been at work in creating a whole lot of different organizations, each meant to infiltrate into different segments of society. Today's Hindutva movement is represented by a dizzying array of different organizations, all of whom come under the banner of the Sangh Parivar, or the family of the RSS. That's why one of the ways to refer to someone who belongs to this fold is to use the term Sanghi. The aspirations of these groups came to the fore in the town of Ayodhya in 1992. In Hindu mythology, the town is seen as the birthplace of the god Ram. On December 6, 1992, a Hindu vigilante mob, organized by the BJP and the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, the World Hindu Council, brought down the nearly 500-year-old Babri Masjid built by the Mughal Emperor Babur. They claimed that this mosque was built on the ruins of a Hindu temple and that had marked the birthplace of Ram. More than 2,000 people, mostly Muslims, were killed in the violence that followed. Hindu nationalists once again struck in 2002 in the Indian state of Gujarat, where Narendra Modi, a lifelong member of the RSS, was brought to power as the chief minister. 5 months into his first term, there was a mysterious act of arson in which 59 Hindu pilgrims were burned to death in a train. Many have argued that this attack on the train was a staged trigger for premeditated violence. The attack, as with all things in India, was blamed on Muslims, and as an act of revenge, Hindu mobs went on a rampage across the state. A mostly anti-Muslim pogrom in which over 2,000 people were murdered took place. The violence included mass rapes of women, widespread looting, and destruction of property. Police and government officials were said to have directed the rioters and gave lists of Muslim-owned properties to them. Modi himself was accused of playing a part in condoning the violence, although in 2012 he was cleared of complicity by a committee appointed by the Supreme Court of India. Nonetheless, that committee has been accused of suppressing evidence according to activist groups. Internationally, Modi was seen as complicit in the violence. Up until he was elected Prime Minister, he was not granted a visa to travel to the United States. In 2014, Modi was elected Prime Minister on an aggressive populist platform. Since then, attacks by Hindu vigilante groups have escalated, with full support of, or at least the consent of, the police and political leadership. These include lynchings, hate crimes, extrajudicial killings, attacking and killing people based on accusations of them having eaten or sold beef, forcing low-caste communities and Muslims, Christians, and Buddhists to convert to Hinduism, and going after Hindu-Muslim relationships, what they have termed as love jihad, which is a belief that Muslim men are luring Hindu women to marry them and converting them to Islam. Besides Muslims and lower caste communities, these groups also have a strong dislike for leftist or progressive groups, and have attacked or killed and tried to silence a number of activists, academics, and journalists. Hindutva-linked individuals have not only captured power on a national level, but they are also being appointed as heads of major universities, media houses, and so on. Modi came to power again in 2019 because, and not in spite of, the atmosphere of hate he had enabled in his first 5 years as Prime Minister. Immediately after he was re-elected, he began to implement his party's long-standing policies, beginning with the clampdown on Kashmir last August, which I will talk about next. Last November, the Supreme Court ruled in the Ayodhya case and basically argued that while the parties that had destroyed the mosque were wrong to do so, the Muslims could not prove their exclusive possession of the site. They turned the site over to a trust that was tasked with building a Hindu temple over it. The Muslim community was given a plot of land away from the Babri Masjid area. This ruling set an extremely dangerous precedent. It basically means that these groups can say that other mosques were built over temples and destroy them as well. And the state has given cover to these groups by providing them with the post facto justification for their actions. Finally, last August, the National Registry of Citizens in the northeastern state of Assam resulted in nearly 2 million people, mostly Muslims, being stripped of Indian citizenship after failing to provide sufficient documents to prove that they were Indian. Contestations over who was a refugee versus who was a citizen have a longer history in the state of Assam, going back, not surprisingly, to the legacies of British colonialism and Assamese nationalism that has sought to assert itself over the Bengali communities that have lived in Assam for over a century. Government officials have promised that they will implement the NRC nationwide. This, with the Citizenship Amendment Act, has set into motion the legal precedent for an ethnic cleansing or genocide to take place. The CAA basically fast-tracks Indian citizenship for non-Muslims, including Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, and Christians from Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan. Combined with the NRC, which is what is feared will happen even though all religious groups may be impacted by a nationwide NRC, where especially minority or marginalized communities like Muslims and lower caste Hindus may not be able to provide their documents to prove their citizenship. The CAA will ensure that only the non-Muslims who are stripped of their Indian citizenship through the NRC can still be granted citizenship, and that the Muslims will not be able to. This means that millions of Muslims will be rendered stateless and refugees in their own homes. There have already been internment camps that have been set up for those who have been rendered stateless in the state of Assam. For this to happen on an all-India level will be nothing short of catastrophic. After the CAA was passed, there were widespread protests throughout India, and it appeared as if the Indian Muslim community had woken up en masse against what this bill entailed for them. Yet, even in these protests, we began to see the fault lines. Indian liberals, leftists, and secularists attempted to control the ways through which Indian Muslims were protesting, decrying any slogans of Muslim assertion. As Kashmiri scholars Samriti Mushtaq and Mudassir Amin have argued, and this is from an excellent article that they've written in The Caravan, and I quote them, "Solidarity from liberals is conditional because of their understanding of Muslims as quintessentially illiberal. How is it that Muslims asserting their Indian identity are welcome, but those asserting their religious identity beyond the liberal framework are silenced? If the people are out on the streets to protect the secular values of the country as enshrined in the Constitution, do those values necessitate for religion to be sidelined, disallow Muslimness in any form in the public sphere, even when the exclusion is clearly about Muslim identity?" End quote. Muslim student leaders who have highlighted these hypocrisies and shed light into the deeper malaise in India vis-a-vis its treatments of Muslims have been placed under greater scrutiny. One such scholar, Sharjeel Imam of the Jawaharlal Nehru University, was detained and eventually charged under the stringent Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, which allows the government to prescribe individuals as terrorists. Another critique that I think is important to acknowledge with these protests, no matter how important they are in this moment of rising fascism and authoritarianism in India, is how there is again this harkening back to a nostalgic, secular, democratic India, without any acknowledgement of the fact that that India itself was extremely violent and majoritarian. One wonders if there is a way to move forward with a real and honest critique of India's secularism and democracy that goes beyond the more obvious and simplistic critiques of Hindutva alone. In response to these protests, the Indian police and vigilante mobs have targeted Muslim areas and neighborhoods, detaining individuals, destroying property, and committing acts of arson. February saw the most horrific violence against Muslims in Delhi by armed Hindu mobs and sanctioned by local authorities. Over 50 people, mostly Muslims, were murdered, and hundreds more injured after BJP leader Kapil Mishra urged his supporters to clear an area where Muslim women were gathered at a sit-in. Even now, during the COVID pandemic, the level of anti-Muslim sentiment in India is relentless. The Indian media has obsessively and exclusively focused on a gathering of the Tablighi Jamaat in March that had led to an outbreak of cases, despite there being overall negligence on the part of different groups in society as well as the government. Commentators blame Muslims for spreading the virus, calling it Corona Jihad. So, I've given a broad overview of what Hindutva entails for India's religious minorities, especially its Muslims. What does it mean for occupied Kashmir? I won't have time to go into too much of the history of Kashmir, but just to give a very brief overview. This is a region that had a popular rebellion against its princely rulers, the Dogras, in the late colonial period as a result of their repressive rule, particularly towards the region's Muslim majority population. During the time of partition, war broke out between the two newly created countries of India and Pakistan over Kashmir, and it was divided between them. India took the issue to the United Nations, which called for a plebiscite to be held that would determine the region's future. The plebiscite was never held and remains at the core of this long-standing international dispute. Indian-occupied Kashmir has had both massive civil and armed resistance against Indian rule over the 72-year period since 1947, as well as grave human rights abuses by the Indian Armed Forces, which includes enforced disappearances, sexual violence, massacres, extrajudicial killings, arbitrary detentions, and torture, to just name a few. In 1947, India enabled a client regime of Kashmiri politicians who had agreed to Kashmir's illicit accession to India, as long as it was able to have a level of autonomy within the Indian state, a status that was enshrined in something called Article 370. The article dictated that India would have control over the region's foreign affairs, defense, and communications, and everything else would be left to the Kashmiri state, including determining who would be a permanent resident, or be able to buy land or property, or be eligible for government employment in the state. Over time, that autonomy has completely eroded as one client regime has been replaced by the next, each further entrenching India's occupation. Kashmiri demands for a plebiscite were brutally repressed in what was being claimed as the world's largest democracy, under the leadership of the Indian National Congress. Kashmir remains the most militarized region in the world, with over 700,000 soldiers that operate with complete impunity. Just today, a young Kashmiri man was killed, brutally murdered, for allegedly crossing a checkpoint in Kashmir, in the district of Budgam. So it is important to note that India's occupation of Kashmir goes beyond party lines and is cheered on by both the Hindu nationalists, but also the seemingly secular liberal intelligentsia. And the experience of Kashmir completely exposes the myth of the world's largest democracy. Thus, what Indians have been seeing today under the BJP has been the reality of Kashmir for decades under the Congress Party. However, there is a particular history of Hindu nationalism vis-a-vis Kashmir that also goes back decades. Kashmir experts argue that the Hindu nationalist project has a longer history in Kashmir and began when Kashmir was ruled by the Dogras, Kashmir's princely rulers during the time of British colonialism before partition. The Dogras sought to establish Hindu sovereignty over a largely Muslim populace that they brutally repressed and exploited. During partition, the Dogras faced a massive rebellion from Muslims in the region of Jammu, which they brutally quashed. In what is today known as the Jammu Massacre, RSS members were embedded with the Indian military and Dogra troops and were involved in the ethnic cleansing of Muslims from Jammu in 1947 to 1948. The region of Jammu used to be a Muslim majority area, and as a result of this demographic change, it is estimated that over 200,000 people were killed and 200,000 others were exiled to Pakistan. It was left with a Hindu majority. After partition, Hindu nationalist groups such as the Jan Sangh, which had ties to the RSS, led by Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, vehemently opposed any special status given to Kashmir and called for the state to be fully integrated into India and for Article 370 to be revoked. Before Modi came to power, Hindu nationalists have allied with pro-India parties in Kashmir in the past and put pressure to intensify counterinsurgency policies and state repression of dissent. The goals of Hindutva were finally fulfilled on August 5th, 2019, when the Indian government revoked the special status of Jammu and Kashmir and made the region a union territory directly under Indian control. For Hindu nationalists, this was a huge victory. The world's most militarized zone was militarized even further and placed under complete communication clampdown for months, something that is still currently happening. Thousands of Kashmiris were detained to ensure that there would be no dissent. Since then, we have seen, and these are just some of the headlines of the media immediately after August 5th. Since then, we have seen India making a number of changes to certain laws in Kashmir and guaranteeing that there is absolutely no way for Kashmiris to resist these changes. Again, remember, in other cases of ethnic cleansing or genocide, this is how it starts, through a series of key decrees and legislative acts. For instance, most recently during the COVID pandemic, the Indian state issued out a series of legal changes in a gazette order from the Ministry of Home Affairs on March 31st under the title Jammu and Kashmir Reorganization Act 2020. This order repeals a number of existing laws in the state and amends others, most significantly in the realm of determining domicile or residency status. These laws define domicile as anyone who has lived in Kashmir for 15 years, or has studied for a period of 7 years and appeared in class 10th or 12th exams in an educational institution located in the state. It also includes the children of a range of Indian officials working in the various bureaucracies, universities, and banks who have worked in Kashmir for 10 years, and that doesn't have to happen continuously, even if the children have never resided in Kashmir. In addition, it includes people who are registered as migrants by the government. The implications for this change are far-reaching and staggering, given that a massive number of Indians can now have residency benefits in a region that is disputed under international law. Given that the Indian occupational machinery in Kashmir consists of over 700,000 Indian Army and paramilitary forces, as well as thousands of Indian officials who have served in various capacities in Kashmir's decades-long occupation, the shift in domicile status is a clear path to demographic change. Most crucially, the order is retrospective, meaning that it includes those who already meet these requirements. While the domicile order focuses on government jobs, analysts say that sweeping changes are to be expected in the category of, as the category of domicile is extended to voting rights, land rights, and other benefits. And this is just a beginning. Now that more Indian businesses and corporations will be able to legally operate in Kashmir, the number of those who will claim domicile will steadily increase. But why is the Hindu Nationalist Project obsessed with Kashmir? Okay, it doesn't seem to want to move. To understand this, second. To understand this, you have to understand that in the imagination of Hindu nationalists, the region is part of Akhund Bharat. In this territorial imagination, the Hindu goddess's head is superimposed on Kashmir. And I'm sorry you can't see that for some reason. This is not moving. But no. For Kashmir to not be a part of this territorial imagination, the goddess's head would be chopped off. And they will not stop at Indian-occupied Kashmir. This is what is important to note. Various Hindu nationalists have called for taking over the part of Kashmir that is currently controlled by Pakistan, under the pretense of this being an integral part of the Akhund Bharat as well. Members of the ruling BJP, in no uncertain terms, have mentioned their desire to create demographic change in the Muslim-majority region and flood it with Indian Hindus. By ensuring that more Indians are able to claim domicile in Kashmir, the future settlement of the region will be rendered obsolete. Kashmir, which is currently disputed between India and Pakistan, still awaits a resolution. A vast majority of Kashmiris would prefer to remain independent or merge with Pakistan. As India changes the demographics, these numbers will be much less significant numerically. There are now fears of a slow and steady ethnic cleansing. The government will create separate colonies, settlements for those who can now claim domicile. They will be protected by an ever-expanding military grid and infrastructure. Kashmiris are already concerned that the government's response to COVID-19 has been to increase surveillance and further an architecture of repression and segregation. Combined with the fact that the Indian government has also repealed a series of laws relating to land protection, this means that land itself will be available for Indians to buy, and they will drive out the local population. As the Indian Consul General in New York City, Sandeep Chakravorty, already chillingly declared last fall, India already has a model, the Israeli one in occupied West Bank. The settler colonial project is replete with gendered violence, as leading Indian politicians have bragged of being not only able to buy land in Kashmir, but also to marry fair-skinned Kashmiri women. Leading Indian multinational corporations are working with Western corporations to plan investment summits, which will lead to further economic upheaval as Indian businesses will be able to come in, buy land, bring non-local employees, and decimate local businesses. The settler colonial project also means environmental destruction. Already, we have heard reports of vast tracts of land that are being subject to deforestation and contracts for industries like mining that have been given to outside businesses that have no understanding of the local ecology. While these changes are expected, what is most alarming is that the Modi government has made this momentous change in the midst of a pandemic. Yet even this is not surprising. India's actions last August have drawn unprecedented global criticism, including in the US, where a bipartisan resolution was introduced to condemn its human rights abuses in Jammu and Kashmir. The Indian Embassy and the pro-India Hindutva lobby, which is essentially one and the same now, spent significant resources to ensure that the resolution did not even make it to the House Foreign Affairs Committee for markup. Given that the attention of the international community is fully focused on controlling the coronavirus, this time was opportune to deflect any criticism. As I conclude, I just want to reiterate just how immensely terrifying and threatening this ideology is, and unfortunately just how unchecked it has gone in the world. The tentacles of Hindutva have reached different parts of the world, including the US, the UK, and Canada, where they are hard at work in branding themselves as natural allies of Western supremacist and anti-Muslim groups. While it seems the international media, after having lauded Modi when he came to power in 2014, despite knowing his role in
Can you stop your share? Sharing your screen.
Yes. Okay. Is that fine?
You can still see it.
Still see the... Okay, hold on.
Yeah, now it's okay.
Okay. While it seems the international media, after having lauded Modi when he came to power in 2014, despite knowing his role in Gujarat, is slowly coming to an understanding of what all of this means, international governments have not done much beyond issue out statements of concern. For this ideology to be confronted, a lot more needs to be done on a global stage. We are starting to see some prominent individuals in the Gulf, which has otherwise had quite close relations with India. You might remember that the UAE leader last year gave an award to Modi after the Kashmir siege had begun. A number of them are finally waking up and starting to threaten to turn out Indian workers that live in the Gulf. But it remains to be seen what real implications this can have. What is even more sinister is that so much of the attention internationally is not done out of actual concern for human lives, but rather concerns over India's waning economic potential. As has always been the case, it will be the people, the Muslims of India, and the Muslims in Kashmir, the Muslims and other marginalized communities in India and the Muslims of Kashmir that will continue to bear the brunt of all of this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hafsa, for updating us about Kashmir and India and like how Hindutva was basically torturing the Muslims in the Indian subcontinent. So, before we move to the questions of the audience, I would like to have my 3 questions first. The first is like, does present-day India, which is example as you explained of 1930s or 40s Nazi Germany, prove two-nation theory perfectly right? Two-nation theory on which independent Muslim Pakistan and so-called secular India were born. Second question is, the present-day India and what it is doing in occupied Kashmir seems to have boosted morale and vote bank of those who wish to join Pakistan. What do you think about this?
Can you say the second question again?
The present-day India and what it is doing in occupied Kashmir, which seems to have boosted the morale and vote bank of those who wish to join Pakistan. I mean the Kashmiris who want to join Pakistan. What do you say about it? And the third question is, in a situation which you described about India, what is there left for Indian Muslims? Do you think that they should have their own Jinnah, like Muhammad Ali Jinnah? Yes, you can answer them and then we'll move to the other questions.
In terms of the two-nation theory, I mean, that's a good question. The thing is, if you actually go kind of into the historiography of Pakistan, that itself has been a bit contested. I mean, I think a lot of Indian nationalists and members of the Congress Party would have liked to place blame on Jinnah for what happened during partition. But if you look at the recent literature on partition, that really is not the case. Pakistani scholar Aisha Jalal has basically argued that Jinnah used the two-nation theory as a bargaining chip, and he basically wanted to kind of create this push with the two-nation theory so that the Indian National Congress would be able to come to an agreement to give Muslims better autonomy within kind of a larger Indian federation. Now, some people might disagree with that and say that no, the Muslim League did intend for the two-nation theory to occur. But, as a historian, I can't necessarily make a teleological argument from 1947 to today. I know that there's this, I actually had my students read this article in the Washington Post by Indian journalist Barkhat Dutt after the NRC and the CIGA was passed. And she said something absurd, like Muhammad Ali Jinnah must be smiling in his grave. And that sentiment, I think, is just ludicrous, because Jinnah really was concerned about the position of Indian Muslims overall in the subcontinent, which is why he tried so hard to fight for their better political rights. So, I don't think he would be smiling, or, the two-nation theory has been rendered proved, because it's contested whether that was actually what he himself had intended in the first place. In terms of the vote bank for Pakistan, this is also an important question, but I think it kind of gets us away from the most important thing right now, which is to focus on ending the Indian occupation. For sure, there are people who support Pakistan in Kashmir, and that support has come in different ways. Some want to merge with Pakistan, others have a kind of solidarity or effective solidarity with Pakistan, given that Pakistan remains the only country on the international stage to raise the issue of Kashmir. So you'll see that in protests, you'll see pro-Pakistan chanting and sloganeering that occurs. To say what level of vote bank that entails is hard to say, because we've never really had a chance to ascertain what Kashmiri demands or aspirations are. There have been polls that have been, done in the past. I think the last one was in 2008 that said that people would have preferred independence. But since then, there's really been no polling or anything that's been done. But I think what we can all agree on is that people want the Indian occupation to end. They want a just process in which Kashmiris themselves are have a seat at the table and create a space where people can actually discuss their own future. I mean, there's no political parties aren't even allowed in Kashmir. All of the pro-freedom leadership is either currently under house arrest or detained in jails. So Kashmiris have never really been able to have that kind of political participation where they associate with groups that actually reflect their political aspirations. So all of that needs to change before we can really get to an understanding of what that future would look like. And what is left for Indian Muslims? I mean, to be honest with you, it's very, very frightening. It would be great if Muslim leaders could emerge that aren't really kind of like the selected lackeys of the Indian state and represent their interests more than they represent the interests of the community. But anyone that really has emerged, has spoken back, has pushed back, has been demonized, has been detained, has been killed. So it's frightening. I don't know what to say, to be honest. So I think there's a way that the diaspora can play a role, especially for Indian Muslims, and try to leverage their issue to different groups that have relations with India, like the Gulf. I know the Indian Muslim community in the Gulf has been actively lobbying with different Gulf officials. And that's one possible way for them to be able to, make some changes. But as of right now, within India, it's a very bleak situation.
Okay, thanks for your answers. There are 3 questions from Dr. Samyal Aryan, who's the director of the CIGA. The first question is, what are the real, not declared, positions of great powers like US, China, Russia, and Europe? The second question is, how do you see an effective pressure point on changing Indian policy, since there seems to be an ideological position than any other factor? The third question is, can you elaborate on the effectiveness or impact of the Indian Muslim political movements, including in Kashmir? Has democracy completely failed in India, or is there a recourse through a democratic process? Oh, there's one more question from him. Would you discuss the presence, popularity, and impact of jihadi groups in Kashmir? Okay.
Okay. The US, China, Russia, and Europe. Okay. I'll start with China. I mean, China and India obviously have a long-lasting rivalry. China ostensibly supports Pakistan's position on Kashmir. They were the ones to kind of push for Kashmir to be raised at the UN Security Council. But they also have kind of a tricky position to play, given that they have also been criticized for their treatment of Muslims, especially Uyghur Muslims. But they are seen kind of as a heavyweight to India in the global arena. The U.S. is a bit of a mixed bag. Obviously, Trump, the current U.S. president, has somewhat close relations with Modi, although sometimes trade issues kind of come up, and Trump also seems to be fond of the Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan too. But the U.S. really cannot move out at this moment of either an understanding that this is India's internal matter or that this is a bilateral dispute between India and Pakistan. So at the most, they can push for dialogue between India and Pakistan, but unlike in the past where they would say things like, Kashmiri will has to be ascertained or the right to self-determination, I don't think they would go so far as to say that now, given that they still do have economic interests with India. But that could potentially change given what direction India continues to head in. Russia has, for the most part, supported India. I know that I think Russia is one of the main providers of weapons to India, so I don't think Russia is really a place of hope. And Europe is also a mixed bag. There's a lot of European parliaments. The Labour Party in the UK has taken a somewhat more progressive position, with a few outliers, of course, there as well. But there seems to be some interest or some potential in Europe in terms of pushing for self-determination. I will say that different parties might talk about human rights, but the issue is not just one of human rights alone. So even if the UN puts out a report that, or Amnesty International puts out a report that speaks about the different human rights violations that are happening in Kashmir, they don't go so far as to actually kind of, at least Amnesty International doesn't, to actually talk about the real root political issue. Pressure points. This is also an important question. I think India's two main pressure points are that it still likes to talk about itself as a secular democracy, even though we've completely seen that unravel. But it still sees itself as that. The leadership still sees itself as that. So I think the most that you can do to unveil what that means, they get extremely upset. For example, if a report comes out, there was a US group recently that basically situated India as a point of concern or a country of concern for religious freedom, and they were extremely upset by it. So I think any kind of reputational damage to India's secular democratic credentials is really important. And also economics are also a pressure point. And I think that is something that will need to be explored a bit more, thinking through something like a boycott, similar to what's been adopted in regards to Israel. The elaborateness of the democratic process. I don't necessarily think that the way out for Indian Muslims is through the democratic process, but then that also doesn't leave us with many options. Right now, just given how much support Modi has, and also how much the state has taken over kind of every single aspect of even political life, there is really no room for Muslims to be able to move within what's going on in India currently. So yeah, I'm not sure if that's a place of hope for them. In terms of popularity of different groups in Kashmir, yeah, so since 2016 especially, there's been a rise of Kashmiris, young Kashmiri men and boys joining different rebel groups, armed groups, and they have the widespread support of the population, who see them as defending them against India's occupation. The numbers, I think in this past year, it seems that the numbers have risen since what happened in August. And already in just this year alone, I think over 50 or 60 rebels have been killed. But yeah, they are popular. Thousands of people come to their funerals. But whether, it remains to be seen whether this is the answer for some sort of a solution, or if a similar thing is going to happen in the 90s, where thousands of Kashmiris got killed, and we weren't really able to come to any kind of resolution of the situation. Yeah, I think those are all the 4 questions.
There are some questions from Facebook as well. Had Akmal. He asks that, is Kashmir issue the prime example of why two-nation theory is necessary in Indian subcontinent? And then there is another question from Asim Qureshi. He asks, Nazia Iram in her book on parenting Muslim children in India writes of how middle-class Muslim parents give their children religion-neutral names in order to give their kids a chance in the education and job sector. Is this becoming increasingly common? And another question is asked by Junaid. He's asking that, How has international communities failed to protect the interests of Kashmiri under the UN resolutions, particularly the five vetoes who have often vetoed in favor or against Kashmir for their own interests or benefits? Yeah, you can answer these three questions and then I'll ask Gordon.
I think I did sort of answer the two nation theory earlier. Um, I mean, I hate to kind of ever be in a position where I would argue that communities that are diverse cannot get along or be able to live together. I would not take that position as such, but I would argue that if you are in a situation where the political setup is such that one community is able to gain majoritarian rights over another, then of course that kind of situation cannot be long lasting. I think we have to imagine a kind of a political community that does respect and treat minorities as, you know, give them the kind of due credit that they need in society, above and beyond what the majority has, so that they are able to feel that they have that level of protection. So I don't necessarily agree with an inevitability of the two nation theory, although I think in India's case, because the way that history unfolded, you know, it seems that that way with the rise of Hindutva. In regards to Asim's question, I mean, yeah, this is kind of what the Suture Committee report, which I think is really important and it's interesting for people to read, where, I mean, just being an educated Muslim in India, issues like trying to get housing, jobs, how you're treated in schools, all of that is impacted. There's this movie that, I think it was made in the 1960s or 70s called Garam Hawa. I would recommend people to watch that. I show that to my students. It kind of gives you an overwhelming sense of the different levels of discrimination that Muslims in post-independence India faced. And things ranging from not even getting loans from banks because people felt, people who were giving out loans felt that they would just run off to Pakistan one day. So, so yeah, I mean, for sure, Muslims, especially more educated or middle class Muslims, have to perform a kind of loyalty to the state, put away their religious identity so that they're not seen as being a threat. And again, it plays up on this whole divide of good Muslims versus bad Muslims. And you'll see that every time something happens, there's war brewing up in between India and Pakistan. It's always the Muslim celebrities or kind of more prominent Muslim people who have to feel the need to, declare their patriotism to India. Because they're always seen as the other, as potentially being Pakistani or having their loyalties elsewhere. So I think Muslims must, have to constantly be playing that game in order to survive. But at one point, you kind of have to ask yourself, like, how much more are you going to give away? Like, at what point do you just resist this imposition that has been placed on you? In terms of the international community and the UN resolutions, for much of the Cold War, it was the Soviet Union that had actually allied with India and kept on blocking every single subsequent resolution on Kashmir. And that became a big issue as well in the 50s and the 60s. Now it seems to be that France is a problem issue as well, because France has close France also has military ties with India, and they've been trying to block any kind of discussion on Kashmir. So I think this is, as with as with Palestine, this is a complete failure of the international order, where certain countries are, that don't necessarily reflect or represent Western interests or hegemonies are given a clean chit to do whatever, and others are, and in places like Kashmir and Palestine are completely ignored. So for sure, there needs to be a complete reimagination of what this so-called international community looks like as well before we can make any progress. And I will say with this, the Muslim countries have been disappointing as well. There is no reason that any Muslim country right now should be actively, Muslim majority country should be actively trying to engage with both India and Israel, but they do on astounding levels. So you can't always blame the West for doing these things. Sometimes Muslim majority countries also have abetted this.
Okay. A Kashmiri student in Turkey is asking you this question. Given the situation Kashmiris are facing with no relief in their future, should Kashmiris not align themselves with Pakistan and fight this occupation, or maybe even seek armed support from Islamabad? There is one more question. In your opinion, why the world has more awareness regarding Palestine as compared to Kashmir? Is it the fault of academia or Kashmiri diaspora? And in your opinion, how important is it to establish a united front or forum that is Palestinians and Kashmiris against these atrocities? And the third question is, how can human rights groups make Kashmir an international issue? Please give concrete proposals if possible.
For the first question, I'm not sure what is meant by aligning with Pakistan. I think Kashmiris do look to Pakistan for taking the issue to the international arena. So I think that kind of alignment is already there, and the expectations are already there with the pro-resistance leadership. But I do think that Pakistan has done what it can, but it also remains limited to be able to push it in certain arenas. So I think there needs to be an international effort of multiple countries, multiple kind of areas of focus that are able to draw attention to what is happening in Kashmir. And as for why Kashmir has not gotten as much attention, I think there's multiple reasons for this. One is, I think at least for Palestine, one of the ways that Palestine was able to get a lot of attention is because of the US's special relationship with the State of Israel. And a lot of that activism happened, especially in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, where a Palestinian diaspora, because it was exiled, I mean, so many Palestinians were just simply exiled and had to do their movements in exile and in the diaspora, whether it was in Lebanon, in the Middle East, or in the United States. So those institutions, those groups have existed for decades, and they've been able to raise awareness, on multiple fronts, including in academia. So I think the Palestinian intelligentsia was just situated, unfortunately, because of their circumstances, in that way to be able to do so. And I'm amazed at how many different organizations exist, not just in the US, but throughout the world. And I think now some of that is happening for Kashmir as well. But for whatever reason, I mean, Palestine signifies an important locus point because of its religious significance for Muslims, and Christians and Jews as well. So there's just a lot more attention given to that place. And Kashmir, I think, has been set aside because it's just seen as an issue of, oh, it's between India and Pakistan, they just have to go figure it out, which makes the international community much less willing to get involved. But I think once you reframe that issue as this is like a decolonial movement, these people are, seeking their self-determination, then I think it becomes a little bit easier for academia, for human rights groups, and so on, to see this as in the same vein as other liberation struggles. What can be done to highlight human rights in Kashmir? I think there have been local civil society groups in Kashmir that have, despite all the odds, done incredible work in just documenting what, especially these past 30 years of immense militarization and human rights violations, what all of that has entailed. I think just documentation is really important. And then approaching different international actors, whether it's the US, whether it's different courts of justice, different countries, different embassies around the world, approaching them and really trying to push them to see this region as something that is continuing to erupt unless they, it's in everyone's interest to find a resolution for it. So until that happens, I just think we have to do whatever is possibly in our arsenal. It has to begin with epistemologically changing how we talk about Kashmir, providing a lot more kind of academic work, rigorous work on it. It has to do with just documenting the atrocities that have been going on there. And I do think the next phase is like more targeted campaigns against particular companies, corporations that are involved in the settler colonial project. The Ambani Group, for example, is a big one. They're completely tied with the Modi government and have business interests everywhere. So I think like naming and shaming these groups who are taking part in this project, and whether there's any kind of Western or other links in different countries around the world with what is happening in Kashmir, but also to India's Muslims and minorities, I think that is the next step. But people should be kind of united in their effort and focus on the goal and then think about what else needs to happen after that.
Okay, I think before people will come with more questions, I had another question as well. Since India aligned with Israel, do you think this ideology of Zionism and Hindutva has actually fueled the atrocities in India and Kashmir as well? And there's one more question that's being asked that can you draw the similarity and differences between the Kashmir issue and the Kurdish issue? And one more question from me. How much do you think the terminology matters? It matters when it comes to writing the narratives of the conflicts like Kashmir or Palestine. Like, for example, whenever we call Kashmir a human rights violation issue, then obviously the attention shifts to the human rights, not that there is an occupation there. Because obviously when we call it a human rights violation issue, then it kind of does become subtly India's internal matter. But when you call India directly an occupation, I mean calling spade a spade, then it does give a different message to the world. What do you say about it?
Yeah, I mean, what is interesting about Hindutva and Zionism, I mean, despite the fact that Hindutva has been for, aligned itself kind of in more Nazi ideology, they also are today so linked with Zionism. So there's an intellectual link, but there's also just a very material link because India and Israel have very close relations. In Israel, I guess, is like the #1 country in terms of selling arms to, or maybe #1 or #2 selling arms to India. They share everything from like intelligence kind of networking and actually like managing like, training each other's police forces and army and things like that. So those ties, I think, are both intellectual but also material. And I did forget to mention with the earlier question about Kashmiris and Palestinians, I do think now more than ever, Kashmiri-Palestinian solidarity is really, really important. And I always am kind of a firm believer in that, our oppressor is multiple. and we need to be. They all coordinate on in such ways, and we also need to be coordinating as well. For Kashmir to be liberated, I think it's important for Palestine to be liberated as well, and vice versa. So I hope that there are more opportunities to be able to kind of build. Those conversations have kind of always been happening, but I think it needs to be happening on a much more greater scale. The Kurdish issue, I will have to, I'm sorry, I'm not as familiar with the Kurdish issue as I should be. I will say, that these are issues of modern nation state formation, where you have something as violent as a nation state that's being formed and is kind of disposed towards a particular national identity, and there are inclusion and exclusions to what that national identity entails. And these nation states have never really been able to figure that out, to figure out how they manage different communities, different religious or ethnic communities. And of course, that is going to lead to resentment and movements for liberation across the board. I think for the Kurdish community in particular, what is painful is that, because of the ways that the lines were drawn, they were divided. I think it's between 4 countries. So you can imagine that is a struggle of its own. But I hope to be able to learn more about that, but I don't know enough at this point to be able to say more on that. In terms of terminology, I think that is, that's really, really important, and that kind of gets us to what needs to change and what needs to happen. I think once you start talking about India as an occupier, that word itself has so much significance as a colonial power that it carries weight. If it's just, I agree. If we're only talking about human rights violations, we're not getting to the crux of what is at stake here. And I think change begins with changing terminologies and how we talk about things. I think I was listening to Brother Asim Qureshi's talk a few weeks ago, where he specifically mentioned that language is really, really important. But at the same time, language sometimes has to be mediated with. So for example, if you are doing advocacy with the United States Congress and you come in and you say things like, India is a colonial power and Kashmiris have been occupied, at this stage it's going to be very hard to find people who will be willing to listen to you. Sometimes you have to go in and say, India is not respecting democratic rights. India is not respecting fundamental human rights. And that's what the Kashmiri diaspora had to do. There are ways in which you have to be very radical in certain positions that you take and spread knowledge and awareness that way. But unfortunately, in some other times, you may have to tone down language to be able to get, some movement made. And that's just the reality of multiple struggles. But we are all kind of pushing for the time that we can get to the, in every single arena, we should be able to say it exactly like it is.
Okay, there are 3 more questions. There is a huge anti-Islam sentiment in many of the Arab governments, including the Gulf states. These governments have intimate relationships with Modi and his gangs. My advice is for Indian Muslims to seek support from other resources. Oh, it was a remark rather than a question, but you can talk about it. Can Kashmiri diaspora approach the World Court to have about the genocide declared by India in Kashmir? And there's follow-up question for Israel-India thing, that since Israel has strong ties with Modi, would you think that the success of right-wing Israelis in occupying Palestine territory in global affairs somehow encouraged Modi to discriminate against Muslims in India or in occupying Kashmir? And if you can just talk a little bit about Islamophobia, the anti-Muslim alliance between Israelis and India itself.
I think the first comment that was made is important. Although I'm surprised to see that all these Gulf leaders are speaking out, I cannot really put too much hope in that, given what they've done to Yemen and other parts of the Muslim world. So we have to take it for what it is. In terms of the diaspora being able to raise Kashmir as a genocide, I think it's a very complicated question because a number of the treaties that you could potentially take India to task for, India is not a signatory to those treaties. And I don't know the exact details because I'm not a legal expert, but just in conversations with some lawyers, it is hard to take India to court, different kinds of courts, whether it's the ICJ or the ICC, because India just doesn't have those kinds of signatories. However, in thinking through the case of Myanmar and with the Rohingya refugees, sometimes all it takes is another country, like I think in the case of the Rohingyas, it was the Gambia, to kind of take the issue somewhere. So I hope that that's also where the diaspora's efforts can be leveraged. Again, I think it needs to happen like in multiple forums. It has to take a legal route. It has to take kind of a, through the media, academia, and so on. Like right now, we need everything humanly possible at our potential to prevent this from happening. And in terms of Israel, so I think for sure in Israel with Netanyahu, Trump in the U.S., Modi in India, I mean, these are all kind of neo-fascist leaders who do get kind of support, and Boris Johnson in the U.K., who are buttressed, right? We know that there's kind of a global rise of fascism around the world, and each is able to either borrow their mechanisms of suppression or just kind of further their anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim rhetoric. They all hype on that. So yeah, I for sure think that there's a connection there. Yeah, I think that's all.
One more question, Dr. Hafsa. Since you have been very active on Kashmir in diaspora, how do you see Kashmiri diaspora behaving, and what is the way forward for it?
So I'm going to focus on the U.S. diaspora because that's the context I know best. I don't want to speak on other contexts. I think in the U.S., we have had members of the Kashmiri diaspora who have been active and engaged on the issue of Kashmir for decades. And these are kind of stalwarts and people in the community that we respect. And yet the issue didn't really gain greater traction throughout the diaspora. And there's multiple reasons for this. I'm happy to go into it, but one has to do with issues of privilege and where the diaspora is located in terms of coming from families that had experienced privilege and, kind of seeking aspirational whiteness or middle class or upper class aspirations in the U.S. and not necessarily be involved in what's going on in Kashmir. But I think a lot of that changed after August 5th, and people really started to see what was about to happen. But I think on many levels, there's still a bit of a misunderstanding about what's going on in Kashmir. I think the diaspora needs to be a little bit more educated because it is situated in the diaspora. It's looking at Kashmir from the lens of the US and from the lens of empire. So, there's, just to give you like one example, like Kashmiris in the diaspora have been encouraged to kind of proclaim that their activism is nonviolent. If you think about why would we have to say like that our activism is nonviolent? What are we exactly trying to prove there? It's an internalization of these Islamophobic discourses that kind of seek, any kind of Muslim political assertion is seen as just being intrinsically violent. So no, you have to go there and like tell the world that you're actually nonviolent because you're not like those other guys who are violent. And that just reproduces its own kinds of absurdities. So I think there's kind of like a lot of education, decolonization that needs to happen vis-a-vis the diaspora as well. But, there are people who are extremely passionate about Kashmir and want to do something to help. there's just multiple things happening, and I think it's important to kind of come to a common platform on what needs to happen and be able to work together, setting aside egos and differences and so on, including ideological differences. I mean, I worry sometimes that we end up kind of replicating the kinds of divisions that exist within Kashmir in the diaspora as well. And I don't think we can afford to do that. We need people to like really, really think about the bigger picture here and kind of move beyond respective ideologies.
Okay. I don't know how will this question sound, but like if we look into the future, like for example, if this regime happens to change tomorrow, like there is no more Hindutva and it changed to Congress for some instance, how do you think how will it impact Kashmir as well as Indian Muslims? Is it going to be any different or like India is going to be same as it was before?
As I said earlier, I don't think India before Modi or the BJP was anything to aspire to, and certainly not in Kashmir, and certainly not for India's Muslims. So if Congress is back, I consider Congress to be soft Hindutva, to be honest with you. So I don't think much will change. They've used and abused Muslims to gain political, mileage at so many different points in Indian history. And for sure, I mean, what they've done into Kashmir is completely unexcusable. So I don't think much will change. I think India needs like a total like rehaul, really. And what that entails is hard. I mean, you have to like really shift 70 years of so much that has been entrenched in the country and is only getting worse. It's possible that what will change is that, annihilation won't be like this ever-present danger, but I think different movements, different groups will have to keep pushing for Kashmiri self-determination. That I hope that if Congress is back, that people don't just, especially in the diaspora, don't just think, oh, okay, we're safe now. Like the settler colonial thing is not going to happen. It's fine. No, absolutely not. I mean, the task is very clear on what needs to happen. So. So I don't think things are going to get better. I think, in fact, we'll just have to continue pushing for the things that need to happen.
Okay, there's one more question that how about working to have RSS identified as a terrorist organization?
Yeah, I think that would be a good step. But I think the tricky thing with that though is, when you use the logic of terrorism, you are also implicating a lot of Muslim groups who are not terrorist groups and throwing them kind of in that same logic. I think that whole logic of terrorism is just a very faulty one to begin with. So something for sure needs to happen in terms of the RSS being boycotted or, like members of the RSS shouldn't be able to travel to certain countries and they should be banned for their activities in different diasporas in the world. But again, I'm hesitant to kind of leverage the terrorism bogey because of how it has thrown Muslim organizations under the bus. As you know, that the Hindutva groups are actively working to get the different Muslim organizations in the US also listed as terrorist organizations. So it doesn't really seem to be a game that can get us very far.
Okay, you talked about like we talked about the Israel and India in like the alliance of Israel and India. What if like Palestine allies with Kashmir? How do you think it's going to make a difference? Like, what is there for Palestine to learn from Kashmir and Kashmir to learn from Palestine? Because the structure of the occupation has been same in both the countries. Although, like the context of these conflicts have been pretty different. But what do you think they have to learn from each other to ally with each other? Because if you see like in the past, like India's West Asia policy was in favor of Palestine, and somewhere down the line you still see a little bit of linearity of Palestinians towards India because India had India was in favor of Palestine before. So where do you think the Palestinians and Kashmiris can ally to basically help each other in all this?
I think one place would be to really explore the idea of the boycott. I think the Palestinians have, um, they have some experience and years of experience on this issue. So potentially like knowledge sharing and maybe even declaring like a joint boycott against both Israel and India, especially given that India buys so many weapons from Israel that it kind of makes sense on a both practical but also moral level to engage in that something like that together. But I think what mostly needs to happen is that leaders, intellectuals, activists, academics should be meeting on a regular basis. And there's a talk recently that was on like the case of detainees across different contexts in Guantanamo, in Kashmir, and on Palestine. And just hearing the Palestinian presenter, it was just so shocking. I mean, just like I felt like I was like listening to a talk on Kashmir, and I felt that I've been to Palestine. Like it's it almost felt like a second home to me because of the ways in which occupation operates and also what it does to people, how it seeks to break their resolve, but it doesn't actually ever do that. So I think there's a lot to be learned and shared about building resilience in these communities as well, and how that happens. And I think Kashmiris can, share what they've done to Palestinians and vice versa. So more than just kind of thinking through the structures of occupation and settler colonialism, it's also just like how to figure out how people survive, manage, live their day-to-day lives under such repressive conditions as well. And I think there's a lot of scope for important things to happen there.
Okay, now that we talked about like the possibilities of the alliance between Palestinians and Kashmiris, and because we're talking about like the Indian Muslims and the Kashmiri Muslims, obviously what's happening to them because of the Hindutva. Do you see an alliance happening between the Kashmiri Muslims and the Indian Muslims, seeing that now Indian Muslims do identify with what is happening to Kashmiris, although we cannot appropriate what is happening to Kashmiri Muslims and what is happening to Indian Muslims. There is like a huge difference. But do you see an upcoming alliance between these two groups?
I do see potential for that alliance, and I think it is happening in some ways in the diaspora where different Indian Muslim communities are in touch with members of the Kashmiri diaspora. But I worry that the focus should not just be on the RSS or Hindutva. And of course, I understand kind of from a practical perspective for the Indian Muslim community, that is their immediate and urgent concern. I know that a number of Indian Muslim organizations have not and possibly will not ever be able to take a pro self-determination stance on Kashmir because of what it entails for them and what it entails for their work. So they are kind of very careful to tiptoe around, they'll speak about, again, human rights in Kashmir and what's happening, but not go so far as to say exactly what's going on. I'm just thinking about the protests that happened after the CIA and the NRC, where in the protest itself, like there were Indian Muslims and Indian leftists and student groups and so on. And most people were carrying a flag, the Indian flag, and they were chanting kind of like Indian slogans. Some of them were also chanting Kashmiri slogans. That's a whole different situation. But you can imagine, as a Kashmiri, I would not have felt comfortable in that situation. Like, I'm not going to be in a protest where the Indian flag is proudly being waved and where, again, harkening back to this idea of India as it should have been or was in the past. Like, that was not what Kashmir has, or that was not what India was for Kashmiris. So I think there will be limitations in that engagement for sure. But I do think that those conversations need to happen, and where alliances can be made, that's a possible start. Yeah, that's my thoughts on that.
Okay, I think this should be the last question. I'll speak again from me. Like in the conflict zones, you always see that there is disagreement. There are conflicts within the locals as well. Like for example, if you see in case of Kashmir, there is an option of like whether Pakistan or India when it comes to the referendum, but then there's a third option which is debatable whether it is actually an option or not, which is independence. Where do you think that? And which is actually, this divide between the locals itself is actually helping occupation to further divide us, and that is basically helping the more to imply the occupation in Kashmir. So where do you think we can bridge the gaps between these two different ideologies to basically make them fight the common enemy, which is the Indian occupation?
That's a good question. I think, there is a natural there's a natural bridge. We don't have to look for a natural bridge. The bridge is that we have to fight against India, and to focus our attentions there. Unfortunately, what ends up happening is that different positions are kind of seen negatively or derided for various reasons. And I don't think that's helpful. I don't think, seeing like for example, just to give you an example, it's assumed that the pro-independence position is kind of this very secular, liberal position, and that the people who are pro-independence don't care about religion. I don't think that's the case at all. I think that's a very false binary to make. So I think there's going to be questions around, what role religion or Islam has to play in this movement, and what that entails. But I think those discussions should happen with good faith, and should happen with an understanding that, just because you might take a position that is somebody might take a position that's not your position, doesn't mean that they are, how do you say, like that they're being a traitor to the cause, or that, they're not authentic or something like that. I think each person has experienced Kashmir and what it's done in different ways, and each person has their own kind of individual relationship to their understanding of what a Muslim society or a state would look like. So to deride what those aspirations are on any side, I think is problematic. So I think that the movement can and should be capacious enough to accommodate this difference, and that is really what's integral. That unity is integral, and to set aside accusations or things that are, going to have us fighting each other more than fighting against India. And I think that good faith comes from actually engaging in conversations with people and creating a space for those conversations to happen. Sometimes I see that this kind of pro-Pakistan, pro-independence line is like so divided, you can't like somehow cross it or talk across it. And I don't think that's helpful either. Have a conversation about what does it mean to have a pro-Pakistan position? What would it mean for Kashmir to be a part of Pakistan? Like, talk about that. What would it mean for Kashmir to be independent? of course, we don't have the mechanisms to even talk about that, but I'm just giving you an example of how that divide can possibly be bridged, and it should be done in good faith as well. But for now, I think all of our attention should be to stop this annihilation of the people, and that's what's what's important for now.
Okay, we're left with last 4 minutes, but I don't want to really upset this. He has asked a question that you need a state government support to launch an effective BDS campaign against Indian companies involved in or supporting Kashmiri occupation. How do we get that around?
State involvement, state government.
Okay. You need state government support to launch an effective BDS campaign against Indian companies involved in or supporting Kashmiri occupation. How do we get that around? Like you talked about Ambani and all those.
Yeah. I mean, I think those who care about Kashmiri diaspora and others who are invested in this should be lobbying their governments. I think each country should have kind of their own separate boycott strategy, can't be uniform across the board, and they should all identify either products or companies that they want to focus on, look at the examples of who exactly is doing business with their country, and identify a list of them and then start. I mean, and I think, we have a lot to learn from the Palestinian movement in this case, and hopefully we'll actually be able to have more conversations around that as well. So yeah, I think it's just a matter of doing research on who these companies are, who these individuals are, and doing all you can to lobby. I mean, we can only do so much in terms of raising awareness. I think you can raise awareness forever and ever and ever, but then you have to actually hit both the reputational kind of risks of the reputational thing that India has, that it still wants to be seen as a secular democracy, and also its economic points as well.
Thank you so much. I know it was very exhausting, but I'm really happy that rather than a monologue, we turned it into a very interactive session and people got good information. So yeah, thank you so much for updating us about all these things and letting us know how we can basically go towards the resolution. Thank you so much, Dr. Hafsa, for joining us.
Thank you.
And for the audience, because you have been with us through whole Ramadan series, so